Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your full-scale introduction to the Modernist period. This will be a two-part video for sure. It will be followed by a separate video, which I'll call Selections Unpacked, working through a few specific poems that don't get as much attention in our coverage here of the Modernist period across literary mediums. So this is capital M Modernism, or the Modern Period, which ranges officially from about 1890 to 1950, and it's those 1890s figures that sort of straddled the border between the Victorian period and the Modernist period that I'd like to start with. In the Victorian period, there were some artists who were already beginning to work into some of the themes and stylistic trends that would come to dominate in the Modernist period. These Proto-Modernists, or Pre-Modernists as they're sometimes called, were some of the forerunners of a movement that would come to focus heavily on representational realism. That's in all areas of literature, that capital R realism, the focus on accurate portrayal of the thing as it's seen or experienced. B, psychological interiority, especially in fiction, but poetry as well, and we've seen this coming. The focus on psychological interiority and the rise of the psychological novel has been well underway for a little bit now. C, absurdity, both social and existential, especially in theater is where we're going to see this. And D, aesthetic rebellion or iconoclasm, especially in poetry, whether that was through minimalism or exploding structural boundaries of old poetic forms. This period was about artistic rebellion in all directions. Everything must go. These earliest reactionaries were piqued to their various social and stylistic rebellions by the disorienting impacts of the Industrial Revolution. That was the first trigger point for these earliest figures. Other contributing factors were the veiled and lurking horrors of colonialism, which some of them were able to access, through their particular life experience. And thirdly, also the social absurdities of Victorian rule, which we talked a little bit about with Oscar Wilde as a sort of Victorian pre-modernist. These figures, these pre-modernists, included people like Henry James, Joseph Conrad, who wrote a novel called Heart of Darkness, which you may be familiar with. It's a kind of psychological horror novel, the central specter of which has to do with the evils that were perpetrated by Britain as a global colonial empire, out of sight and out of mind for most ordinary British citizens. The film Apocalypse Now is a direct adaptation of Heart of Darkness, only with the United States in 1970s Vietnam substituted for Britain in late 19th century African Congo. Also among our key pre-modernists, very importantly, were a whole bunch of Irish lads, including our familiar friends William Butler Yeats and Mr. Oscar Wilde. You cannot talk about modernism without talking about Irish folks. Can't do it. So on that note, I'm going to recommend you to an excellent short crash course video on the Irish Renaissance as a theater movement, which was sort of, Victorian period into the modern period, which will give you a really great sense of the very important influence that Irish artists had, especially Irish dramatists, had on the development of modernism in English language literature. A huge amount of modern literary stock was generated outside of the United Kingdom. It was generated in Europe. France was a big one, particularly for modernist thought and theory and art. Absurdism is Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher and literary artist. But in the English-speaking world, Ireland really led the charge on some important aspects of what became the modernist literary movement, including a more English-speaking brand of absurdism, which would have risen out of Ireland's experience of the absurd under British colonial rule. Strict and rigorous realism, the vernacular turn, or placing a heightened value on reflecting culture through the unglamorous working class realities of how people in different places speak, i.e. dialect, and stream of consciousness writing, which is a bit more of a fiction feature of modernism that we'll hear more about later. But all of these pillars of modernist style were championed early on by Irish literary artists well before England really caught the message. So there's a link to that crash course video in the description of this video on YouTube. Press pause, click over, have a look. I'll wait. Note, you can skip from 3:38 on the crash course video to 6:47. The speaker will pick up describing how one of this particular Irish playwright called Synge, one of Synge's plays, went about achieving its hyper-realistic goals. The part you're skipping is basically a summary of the play, which you don't need to know. Go ahead. I'll wait. All right, welcome back. We're talking about forerunners of the modernist movement, those you might call pre-modernists. We've learned a bit about the Irish influence, and in Oscar Wilde's case, some would call it an Anglo-Irish influence. I also need to remind you about the Americans. You might remember that American Romanticism, which we studied back in term one, way back in term one, it happened later than British Romanticism. So while British Romanticism and Modernism were divided by the intervening Victorian age, which is where our Irish friends were getting busy rocking the scene, American Romanticism rolls out right through the very end of the 19th century. So it pretty much butts up directly against the Modernist period. Thus, if you have a look back at some of our American transcendentalist poets, particularly Walt Whitman, you may find some kinship between the overall flavor of his work, Whitman's work, and some of the poetry that we'll be studying in this unit. The poem of his that we covered for Romanticism, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, is perhaps not the best example of this overlap. But for studying purposes and for example's sake, if you were to have a look at any section of his poem Song of Myself, from his collection Leaves of Grass, you'll get a much better taste of the overlap that I'm talking about. Do be warned though, it is long, it's dense, it's a bit weird, it's a bit modern. Purely mentioning it for those of you who might like to take a quick look just for perspective. Moving on. What was already fomenting towards the end of the Victorian period in terms of the reactionary priorities and worldviews of artists exploded. And I feel like I should say, pardon the expression, it exploded with the turn of the 20th century and the onslaught of the First World War, which was followed by a short period of decadent, sort of denialist sorrow drowning during the Roaring Twenties. Those of you reading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald for our novel study this unit, that's your moment, your context is that Roaring Twenties sort of fallout after World War I. Followed that, so we've got World War I, we've got the Roaring Twenties, followed by a massive stock market crash in 1929 that triggered the Great Depression, which was only ended by the ill-fated stimulus of the Second World War, which was an even more cataclysmic instance of global violence than the First World War. That second war was one of such colossal devastation. The intense trauma of these closely clustered events was something felt around the world, in numerous countries, by many races. Obviously, it was felt differently in different countries according to the unique ways that various peoples experienced the events of those conflicts and privations. But the radical impact of this period, just as a basic fact, was global, and it cannot be understated. Thinking it in terms of visual art, picture some of the Impressionist or even Expressionist artworks that were being worked on through the end of the Victorian period, and then go look up anything by Picasso. Any of his Cubist paintings. We're going from this to this. Perspective has been shattered, reorganized fundamentally in the Modernist period because of everything the world has been through. And a quick sidebar here about the advancing technologies of war and the impact that that had not only on people's experience of war trauma, but also on literary art. In The Almond Blossom by D.H. Lawrence, which we worked on this week, there is a huge amount of harping on the words of metal, on iron and steel, steel and iron, the age of iron. World War I was the first large-scale conflict between like highly developed, advanced countries since the Industrial Revolution, which means it was the first mechanized war. The big scary weapons of previous or more recent wars were things like cavalry, men on horses with swords, cannons, like big one-shot mofos that have to be rolled out by a team of guys on wheels. There were guns, but they would have been muzzle loaders. It was just completely different. We weren't talking about tanks and shelling and mustard gas and automated rifles. It was the trench warfare experience, the mechanized trench warfare experience of the First World War gutted people psychologically. I mean, its devastation cannot be overstated. I think it's something that we can all relate to even now, because we know that since the two world wars, there's been another major technological revolution, namely the digital revolution, and we know that the next mass scale conflict, if there is to be one, is going to be fundamentally different, because drones and tech warfare and things like that, it's scary, right? We can see it coming, and this was part of the impact that the two world wars period had on people of the modernist era and the resulting art, and you can see some of that very clearly in Almond Blossom by D.H. Lawrence. So, modern artists were iconoclasts, which literally means breakers of sacred images. And not just for fun either. So some of them were gleefully doing it, and others were just angry. These folks made their careers systematically tipping all the sacred cows of previous eras of literary art. For them, the world had been turned completely upside down. There was a shared feeling that life had never, ever been as it was now, and would never be the same again. And art had to reflect that. At minimum, it had to reflect the differences that people saw and felt, both in the world around them and inside themselves. But at best, it might try to help people process those differences, process those traumas, the resultant feelings of alienation from life itself, and point out some kind of way forward. These were some of the tasks that modern artists began trying to step up to, some of them anyway. To this end, modernist artists took the rules of form and decoration that had been cherished by previous generations of artists and ran absolutely amok, threw out the book, wrote in its margins, scribbled rude cartoons, like they were messing with everything. Some of the attendant rebellions or innovations of the Modernist period were subtle in form, but profound in impact. One example was the Imagist movement in poetry, which began in the late Victorian era and persisted into the Modernist period. We saw a very early sort of proto-Imagist example in E. Pauline Johnson's Lullaby of the Iroquois. I believe I spoke about that when we covered her. But I'll post a full definition to Populi just so the term is clear for sake of efficiency. High modernist examples from our readings in this unit include William Carlos Williams' poems, The Red Wheelbarrow, and This Is Just to Say. Williams is very much the textbook study in Imagism. He's the guy. But I would also include, and listen to my whole thought here because there are some caveats, I would also arguably include Randall Jarrell's poem, The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, from among our war poets. Not the whole poem. It's a little bit too dreamscapey, metaphorical to be really imagist, but the last line, the very last line of Randall Jarrell's The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, which is appallingly literal and stark and unmediated. That last line is a very imagist line. And it's an angry imagist line. Other examples of imagist poems or imagist-influenced poems would be Margaret Atwood's You Fit Into Me, which was a late addition to the reading, so you might not have read it. Almost all of our listed P.K. Page poems, and Seamus Heaney's Digging, to an extent. Seamus Heaney is the same poet behind the translation of Beowulf that we read in Term 1, just to make that connection. Another feature of modernist literary art across the board, poetry, drama, fiction, film, everything, is something that I would call the vernacular turn, which we've spoken about a little bit a couple of times here in this video. It was alluded to in the Irish Renaissance crash course video. The vernacular turn was an expression of capital R realism, focusing specifically on the true representation of natural, everyday speech. This was addressed a little bit, as I said, in that video on the Irish Renaissance. It's also reflected clearly in Robert Frost's poetry from our selections this week. William Carlos Williams' poem, This Is Just to Say. Our Philip Larkin selections, for sure. And most especially in our fiction selections this unit. You're really, really going to get this vernacular turn in the short stories by Hemingway and Faulkner, as well as the two novels. On this note of the vernacular turn, I'd like to remind you of one of the very first readings from our course, way back in like week 1, an excerpt from Robert Macfarlane's book Landmarks, which talked about the relationship between protecting regional dialect and protecting nature. Because regional dialects have highly specific nature words that evolved out of rural populations' intimate working relationships with the land. And by protecting these highly specific nature words that carry knowledge inside them, Macfarlane's thesis is that we can also protect our awareness of nature and perhaps by extension protect more of nature itself. The Modernist period is where you're going to start seeing a lot more dialect in literature, like in high literature, well-reputed books, both poetry and fiction, drama as well, basically everywhere. Modernists sought to portray the exactitude of speech, along with the unique poetry, vibrancy, wisdom, worldviews, land relationships, everything that were housed in different ways of speaking. This was part of their realism, and those of you who chose to read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God for our novel study in this unit, you will see a lot of that in that book. We are running a little short on time for this first half of the video, so I'm going to clue it up here. Click on over to part 2 and we will carry on.